Sometime in the 8th or 9th century CE, hundreds of years after the fall of the Roman Empire, an unknown poet somewhere on the island of Great Britain found inspiration while exploring the rubble of an overgrown ruin. This poet lived in a time known as the Middle Ages of Europe, or the medieval era, or sometimes the Dark Ages. We don't know who this poet was or where they might have lived, but they wrote a poem, known now simply as The Ruin, in the language of Old English that has survived to this day on a yellowed and fire-damaged piece of parchment. This poem can help us to imagine the kind of world that they inhabited, living in the shadows of enormous, crumbling ruins of a bygone age.
Wondrous are these wall stones, broken by fortune, the citadels crumbled, the work of giants ruined. The roofs are collapsed, the towers tumbled, the pillars bereft. Ice on the arch scarred the storm wall, old, eroded, weathered and worn. The earth's grasp keeps the master artisans, deceased and decayed in the firm grip of the ground, until 100 generations of human peoples have departed. Often this wall, lichen grey and rust-coated, endured one regime after another, withstood under storms, steep and curved, it fell.
When you read these words, it isn't difficult at all to imagine our lone, unnamed poet climbing over the crumbled stones and toppled pillars of this mysterious, ruined place and wondering to themselves, who could have built this place? How did they construct these arches, these vaults and domes? How were they able to build something so grand and complex? And why would they do such wondrous things and then just leave it all behind? Why did they leave us behind? Hey everyone, it is week 12, and we're going to dive into a period of European history known as the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is this period of time that stretches for roughly about 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. And this week we'll just cover the ideas and events to sort of give you a background before we dive into the art and the literature that you'll get in the next couple of weeks. A few years back, I heard this particular episode of a show that I enjoy called Live From Here. As you can see here, it was aired on May 16th, 2018. Live From Here is an audio show that is on NPR, oftentimes on the weekends. And it's a variety show that's performed in front of an audience, but it's meant to be heard. So oftentimes when skits are done, like the skit that you're going to see right here, you're going to see actors standing on stage with scripts in hands and things of that nature. But that's because this was all meant to be listened to. Right? You're going to have, again, people with scripts reading a skit. You're going to have a guy off to the side who's doing Foley by doing sound effects and things. And in this particular skit that was done, I've always found it particularly funny because it does in a very humorous way give us a nice little introduction to what the Middle Ages were like. So let me kind of set up what you're going to see here. As I just mentioned, you're going to see some people sort of acting out an audio play. And in this audio play, there's sort of a satirical take being made on the Middle Ages by creating this scenario in which there is a high school in the Middle Ages that is graduating. That's, the idea of high school is a very modern idea, right? It was not happening in the Middle Ages. And at that graduation, a valedictorian, like a high school graduating valedictorian here in the United States, is standing up to give her speech. Right? Again, this is not a thing that would have actually happened in the Middle Ages. It's a way of, as I said, having a satirical take on the Middle Ages. But I want you to watch and listen to this and see if you don't come away with certain themes that maybe describe what the Middle Ages were like.
And now, please welcome the valedictorian of Medieval High, class of 1347, Miss Catherine of Dingleshire.
Oh, thank you so much. Guys, sorry. Guys, we did it. Class of 1347, graduation, woo! What a trip, huh? The road was rough, but we got through all those nights of homework and days full of breaking rocks into smaller rocks, or going to the well for water only to find that there was no water. And also now you have the Black Death. We'll treasure these memories for the rest of our lives, a full 10 years if we're lucky. I think back on all the memories of the last 4 years. Who can forget when Stephen the Surf gave half our class the plague? Or when Stephen the Surf gave half of the remaining half of the class the plague? Or when Graynard, the gravedigger's son, pulled that hilarious prank during the eclipse and convinced everyone he was a sorcerer who could blot out the sun, and then he was consigned to the lunatic's asylum for life? What a class clown, right? Or when Leanne the homely, daughter of Beardskin the phlebotomist, came back from winter break with all those funny holes all over her head and acted super weird for like days until Stephen the Surf gave her the plague through one of her skull holes. Good times. May they all rest in peace. So what's next? For some of us, it's whooping cough. For others, it's off to college, Shire, the next town over, where Miner, the tapestry merchant's father, once traveled with no shoes. And some say he met a real knight before succumbing to a slight head cold and being torn apart by wild sheep. Some of us will retire with our grandkids. Some of us will be tortured for our beliefs, or even torture others for their beliefs. So many possible paths. So seniors, as we head off on our brave journey into the wide, flat world, may we always remember the words of Lady Principal Mary the Wise as she was mauled to death by her own pet hog. "Get this forsaken beast off me," she said. "Dear God in heaven, why, ow." And as we travel life's brief highway, let's raise a cup of mead and always keep a flagon of the spirit of Dingleshire High in our hearts. Go fighting leeches! BT Dubs, anyone who's still alive had better sign my year-illuminated manuscript. No excuses, Ethelred, I see you. I don't care if you can't write, none of us can. Go class of 1347! Woo!
That's Serena Brooke. So yeah, as I said, it's silly, it's ridiculous. But again, you pick up on some real themes there. Like if you really think about things that were talked about within what was meant to again be a very satirical take on the Middle Ages, you pick up on some themes such as disease and death and superstition and very hardcore and hard-held religious beliefs and religious persecution of others who don't have those same beliefs. And there at the very end as well, sort of illiteracy, right? These are things that that are indicative of what the Middle Ages were like, as well as you may have noticed the interesting thing that was sort of happening with people's last names, right? You heard her speak about a number of people where she referred to them as so and so, and then either that person's profession or that person's father's name, right? So that is where a lot of surnames come from. If you have a last name that refers to a profession, carpenter, miller, tailor, smith, right? Those names were developed in the Middle Ages. Or if you have a name that is followed, is a person's name followed by the word son, John's son, Anderson, Will's son. Those are medieval names as well, because this was a time when those surnames hadn't been developed yet. And so everyone was sort of just referred to as whatever your name was and your profession, or your name and the fact that you were so-and-so's son. So at some point, if you have the surname Johnson, someone in your past was the son of a guy named John. Hence Johnson. And then that name just sort of got passed down as we went. Now, understand, right? All of that sounds so horrible, and I get it. But don't understand that many things were accomplished during the Middle Ages. Please don't come away from this with the misconception that nothing was happening during this entire 1,000 years. However, in the rest of the world, there wasn't the same level of death and pestilence as there was in Europe during this time. Like, science was being explored in other parts of the world at this time, but those things went by the wayside in Europe. And some of that leads to a lot of like the death and pestilence. A lot of that leads to superstition. There's all that. And there are many reasons why all that happened. But a lot of them have to do with that fall of the Roman Empire. So here we are, shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire. I say shortly after, about a century after the fall of the Roman Empire. And though Europe is looking considerably different than it did before. Let me get my laser pointer, right? Let's look over here at Eastern Europe. I started to say Eastern as I was pointing at Western, but Eastern Europe, you'll note, and down into Africa, there, all that stuff in pink, there's the Byzantine Empire. I know it says Roman Empire right there. This is Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire still going good, perfectly strong. But over here, the western portion of what had been the Roman Empire, Western Europe over here, is broken up into several different kingdoms and territories and things of that nature. From the Visigoths down here to the Saxons up here, the Burgundians here, all these different small kingdoms that break up what would be the British islands, right? There's a lot of instability that is happening at this point in Western Europe, as all of these places are sort of getting a foothold on things. Right? Even the peninsula of Italy itself, which would have been the seat of the Roman Empire, you can see is broken up into several different regions. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, right? You hear that term, Middle Ages. Well, then clearly the question pops up of what, the middle of what, right? Because the Middle Ages, as I just mentioned ago, was a period of time of nearly 1,000 years of history, of European history between the 5th and 15th centuries. But there are other names for the period, such as the Dark Ages, the Age of Religion. The most common name is the medieval period, because medieval is, I think, a Latin term that literally translates to middle. Right? So considering these names that are given by historians to this particular period of time, what are the assumptions that we might make about life in this period and why it might be referred this way? Well, a lot of it we already sort of got from that piece that we just watched from live from here, right? We hear things like the Dark Ages because science and science has kind of gone by the wayside, and disease and pestilence have sort of moved into their place, and superstition, things of that nature. But and in the Age of Religion, what might that suggest about this period of time? Well, we're certainly going to see in a moment, as we're going to see what happens to the Catholic Church during this period of time. But the Middle Ages, or the medieval, which just means middle era, what does it suggest about this time? And again, the Dark Ages, right? All that seems to suggest a period that's going to come after this, right? Because it's not as if the people living in the time period that we now call the Middle Ages refer to the time they lived in as the Middle Ages. This denotes a time period that's going to come afterward, right? After the Middle Ages, that's going to look at this time period as a period of loss. What do they feel like they have lost? Why is it a middle period? Well, it's because they're going to be looking back at ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and they're going to be saying, hey, we liked what they were up to, right? There was awesome stuff getting built. There was science. There was education. There was all that really great stuff. And we want to go back to that. And all that time in between was just this period of time when we were languishing, right? That is the viewpoint of a period of time that's going to come afterward called the Renaissance. The Renaissance we'll talk about more in depth in English 202. So if you're signed up for English, if you have registered for English 202 next semester, you'll get that information from us then. At that particular time period, and they did refer to themselves as living in the Renaissance, see this huge period of time as a period of time where all of the good stuff that they saw the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks having done as being lost. And so they sort of see Europe as languishing. But again, I don't want you to come away from this thinking that nothing happened in the Middle Ages. Certainly, the Renaissance wanted to frame the narrative about the Middle Ages as though nothing really of importance happened during that time. But that's not the case. And so, as such, to take a look at this, let's divide the Middle Ages up into a few periods here. First, we'll talk about a period known as the early Middle Ages, which goes from about the 5th century to about 1000 CE. So from the fall of Rome to about 1000 CE. And a few of the key events that happened during this time. The end of the Western Roman Empire happens, which meant that the political unity of Europe had collapsed, as evidenced by that map that I showed you a moment ago. And also during this time, we have the rise of Islam. Islam rises up as a third Abrahamic religion coming from the Middle East, and will start to sort of make its way from the Middle East into Europe. In response to the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the Germanic tribes that formed their own kingdoms, referred to as the barbarian kingdoms by the Romans, and these kingdoms are just constantly fighting one another, adding to that instability. Also, Christianity gets an even firmer foothold in Europe and begins to spread to the most remote areas of Europe, which starts to bring a little bit of stability to Western Europe. As well as one moment of stability happens when Charlemagne the Great forms what becomes the Carolingian Empire. Sometimes it's going to be referred to as the Holy Roman Empire. It was this attempt to revive the Roman Empire, which lasted a good 88 years. So that was a little bit of stability in the region. Then also there were these waves of invaders that come into Europe during this particular moment in time. There are the Vikings who are coming from the Scandinavian areas. You have Islam, again, moving into the area, and the Magyars that are coming into the area. And everyone is constantly scared of some outside force invading into the area. And this instability, as well as sort of abandoning of, and also just plain forgetting a lot of the medical advancements that had been made by the Romans, leads to disease and pestilence in Europe. When diseases make their way into Europe, during this particular period of time, there's just no fighting them off. So a lot of death happens as a result during this time period. And then also during this time period, right, as again, the Roman Empire and its structure is gone, new societal models come into play. And one of the biggest, excuse me, one of the biggest ones that comes into play is feudalism. Feudalism is a societal structure, because calling it a government is a bit generous, that structures power relationships, are specifically around the holding of land in return for protection, goods, and services. That's feudalism. And within that, you understand feudalism is also where we get our lords and ladies, our kings and queens, our knights, and our serfs and our peasants, all of that. Right? We'll get into that a little more in depth in just a moment. I mentioned the rise of the Catholic Church at this time. We're talking about the Catholic Church specifically. The Eastern churches, they're doing their thing over in the Byzantine Empire. As the Catholic Church rose in power, it became really the main source of stability during the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church became this huge political power in the region, placing itself as the ultimate authority over the power of kings. They also sent out extremely successful missionaries to far-flung areas of the European continent. And as such, right, there are a lot of stories. A lot of areas of Europe have stories about a missionary who arrived in that region and brought Christianity to that particular region. Right? Now, it isn't as if those regions didn't already have their own pre-existing religions and pre-existing beliefs. Right? And so oftentimes these missionaries arriving in those areas would take the stories or the beliefs or the literature even, of a particular region, and make little tweaks and changes to it to showcase how it could actually be about Christianity, right? And so if you are a practitioner of Christianity, if you consider yourself a Christian, again, just as I said last week, no shame, no judgment, many of your practices and traditions may have their roots in some missionaries changing up of a story or a mythology of a people that he encountered to make it about Christianity. And they would also take festivals and things that were practiced by the people that they would encounter and make those suddenly in being about Jesus instead of whatever original gods those people worshiped. And yeah, so these missionaries were out there doing that. That increases the power of the church. And so the Pope became a symbol of unity in a time of great change. Again, though, another symbol of stability comes in the form of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, who forms the Carolingian Empire. He was, again, Charlemagne the Great, as he was referred to. He lived from about 741 to 814 CE. And his empire that he formed in sort of what is current day Germany, in that sort of area, was the largest empire to take hold in the western part of Europe since the Roman Empire. And he saw it as a return, right? He saw this as an opportunity to return to the Roman days, right? Here we already kind of have someone who, like the Renaissance that will come centuries after him, was already kind of looking back at Rome as this glory time and a time to recapture, right? And Carolingian, in this case, right, we call it the Carolingian Empire. That is a term that just translates into the descendants of Charles, because it was ruled by the Carolingian dynasty. These were descendants or people who ascended to the throne, but all of them went by the name Charles or Charlemagne. Right? They all ruled over this area for a good 88 years, and so it became, after his time, after their time rather, the Holy Roman Empire, and that lasted well into the 18th century. Yeah, like into the 1700s, we had at least a small area of Europe that referred to itself as the Holy Roman Empire. You know, it was not exactly holy. It was not at all Roman, and eventually it was barely even an empire. But in the Carolingian times, it was an empire. It was the largest and the most stable region of Western Europe at the time. And then let's take a look here again at because we talked about feudalism. Let's look at the feudal power structure. Right? Let me get I already have my laser pointer. All right, so again, the feudal pyramid of power. All of this has to do with the holding of land. And that is the determination of power. So at the very top of the whole thing, you have the Pope. Yeah, the Pope, the Catholic Church set themselves up in such a way that the Pope was like the supreme power in Western Europe. Because the Pope in Catholic belief systems was believed to be the vicar of Christ, right? He was a person on earth who had a direct line to the desires of Jesus Christ. Right? And so he could be the one to tell a king or queen, God has chosen you. God has ordained you. And he also had the power, if he was kind of sick of a particular monarch, to find someone else and say, nope, I'm sorry, God has chosen you. And you can't argue with that. You can't argue with God. You can't argue with the Pope. The Pope is the vicar of Christ after all. And so what we have is the Pope then choosing monarchs. Right? He is the one establishing who runs what. Then we have the monarchs, right? The kings, the queens, who rule the land. So they have all the land. They then parcel out land, and the people who live there, right? They've got control of all that, but they parcel out land to the nobility. Right? The nobility are particularly wealthy individuals who are in the monarch's favor. Right? Rarely, if ever, have these people earned their wealth. They're generally in some way a friend of, or an advocate of, or in some way they are connected to whoever the monarch is. And the monarch parcels out the land of the kingdoms to the nobility, the nobles. The nobles, though, right, they're not working class. They will not be working that land. So they parcel out their land, which is referred to as a fief, passes down to the vassals, or what we might call the knights, who again are militaristic people, but also they live by a code of chivalry, right? If you're familiar with all of the fairy tale type romanticized stories of knights sort of living by a code, but I mean a lot of that has really sort of been overlaid upon them by later generations. In their time, oftentimes knights were seen as bullies and as thugs, but they had their own little small portions of land, and then they would take that land and would then pass that on down, parcel that out, lend its use out to the working class, the merchants, the farmers, the craftspeople, the peasants, the serfs. They're all down at the bottom. What are they doing? They're working the land, or they're producing goods and services, right? They're only allowed to do so because people up the chain have allowed them to have a parcel of land that's not theirs, but they can work on it, right? They can work on it by, again, either creating goods and services or working the land and producing food. They can keep a small portion of that for themselves, and the rest of it gets sent up the chain. The foods and services sent up to the vassals and knights, who take their portion and then send that up the chain to the nobility, along with their, since we're talking about knights, their loyalty, their protection, military service, that gets put up the chain. And the nobility, right, are not only getting the food, getting the goods, getting the services, but they also are taxing the vassals. So they get that money. The tax money comes to them, and they send that on up to the monarch, and the monarch sends a portion of that on up to the Pope, right? Because we got to keep our salvation in mind. That is the feudal pyramid sort of whittled down. It's a bit more complex than that, perhaps, but that's enough for what we're talking about right now. Then there's a period known as the High Middle Ages. And I'm not going to get into so much the late Middle Ages, at least here, just to kind of keep things short. So we're going to take the High Middle Ages, and we're going to leave the late Middle Ages for when we talk about the artwork of the time. So the High Middle Ages are a period of time that goes from about 1000 to 1300 CE. And when we talk about some of the key developments of this particular time period, first off, we see all those waves of invasions finally coming to an end. And this allows, again, for a little bit more stability in this period of time. The Holy Roman Empire, France, and England begin to build their kingdoms and become much larger than the little small chopped up kingdoms that they had been in those same places. And they start to look at least a little more like their modern day selves. The borders start to look a little more like what we would recognize as England and France and Germany, which is what the Holy Roman Empire essentially would be. The Crusades began during this time. The Crusades are this extremely, extremely interesting period of time that happens during the Middle Ages, particularly the High Middle Ages, where Western Europe, being Christian, looks back to the area of Israel as the Holy Land. And Israel, during this time, is dealing with Islamic peoples sort of moving into the region and conquering areas of it. And so the Pope, the Pope at the time, over in Western Europe, sees that as an opportunity to go back and defend the area where the religion came from. But let's not think that all of his motivations were altruistic, because another thing that's very important to the Catholic Church at this time are relics. Relics are purported artifacts that come from the Holy Land, or that belonged to a particular saint, a particular disciple, or to Christ himself. And the number of relics that are being passed around in Europe are limited. If you go back and you fight in Israel for its independence, then you can also get yourself some more artifacts, more relics. Also, money and goods can come back as well and help to enrich Western Europe. There were so many crusades. There were numbers sort of range from 8 to like 12 or so, but they took place over a few centuries of time. And each crusade was often called for by a pope, or sometimes it might be a local monarch who then would gather up knights, gather up people who were willing to volunteer, and then send them to the Holy Land to go and fight. Very few of these ever accomplished much at all. Right. And so oftentimes, even to this day, if someone is fighting for a cause, it gets referred to as crusading, especially if that cause is seen as sort of a lost cause. Like, this is my crusade. I will die on this hill. That kind of thing. Right. That terminology comes from the Crusades, where, again, it was several times over the period of a couple centuries that armies were sent from the Western European region to the Holy Land, what was referred to as the Holy Land, to fight against usually Islamic peoples who were moving into the region. Also, interestingly enough, the universities begin to emerge during the High Renaissance, and the university system that was developed during the Middle Ages honestly hasn't changed that much over the many centuries since then, right? So everything that you do as part of being in Bethel University has its roots in what was developed during this time. So the idea of departments, the art department, the English department, the science department, whatever, all those different departments, that was a Middle Ages university thing. The names of the degrees that you get, right? You get a bachelor's degree, right? It is called a bachelor's degree because it is a degree that you get that hasn't been coupled with anything else, like a bachelor. And then you go and get your master's degree, and then you go and get your doctorate. Those degrees are all very medieval. That was developed in the university system. The university system also developed this way of sort of like having a core of courses that you would take, and then another set of courses that's very much involved in the particular thing that you want to study. And look, when we graduate, the fact that we all walk around in these robes and these hats, like these hats with these tassels, and when you do get either a master's or a doctorate, you get that hood that is then draped over your shoulders. If that all looks strange to you, because you don't walk around wearing stuff like that normally, it's because all of that is pomp and circumstance that came from the Middle Ages, right? And we've just sort of hung on to it. So if there are things that you hate about the university system, well, you have the Middle Ages to blame for that. And that political stability that starts happening as a lot of kingdoms start to consolidate, and the Pope really starts shoring it all up as well and getting things much more stable, leads to finally some economic growth. And that economic growth can lead then to larger towns and cities, and those larger towns and cities start to recover from some of the disease and pestilence of the past. And you can sort of draw a direct line between that and the Renaissance that's going to come in the next few centuries, again, that we'll talk about next semester in English 202. Now, just for the fun of it, I like to end this lecture with some stories about medieval medicine, just because it amuses me. Because again, during a time when science was sort of shuffled off to the side, and a lot of superstition was brought into place, and again, a lot of people getting confused because a combination of things. Again, a lot of the advancements of the Roman Empire had just been lost and forgotten, just completely forgotten, and in many cases, intentionally so, right? The Catholic Church repressed a lot of the ancient Roman and particularly the ancient Greek writings on things. So that's gone. Then you've got Christianity moving in, really sort of preaching the power of prayer, but then also encountering religions and mythoses that are pre-existing in the areas where they sent missionaries, and those sort of get swaddled up in Christianity as well. So a lot of weird sort of superstitions end up popping up, superstitions that are particularly fun. And so when it comes time for medicine, it's all very, to our way of looking and thinking of it now, very silly. So the fundamental assumption in medieval medicine was that people became sick because they had sinned. Right? Never mind that you've got in the Bible that people are looking to for their religious beliefs. You got Jesus telling people over and over again that people's illnesses are not the cause of their sin, or not caused by their sins. That was still the belief at the time. As part of that sort of repression of science, the church had banned doctors from examining corpses. So knowledge of anatomy was very limited at the time. Interestingly, also, because, as a doctor in the Middle Ages, you needed a side gig. So doctors were also part-time butchers or barbers, right? Because those are the people who kind of understand cutting instruments. And so if you're trained to be a doctor, well, you may not have a ton of business. So you also work as a butcher on the side, or you work as a barber on the side, or maybe even the doctor thing is your side business. And this then is the reason why the barber's pole looks the way that it does, right? The barber's pole, you've seen it. It's the pole that's outside a lot of barbers. It sort of spins around, and it's got swirled stripes, red and white stripes. And in this case, the barber's pole points back to those old medical connections with those connections with the medical field, and how doctors were also barbers. The red symbolizes blood, and the white symbolizes bandages, right? So even in this modern time, we have this little medieval thing that sticks with us, right? In the same way that the university system is still very medieval, the barber's pole is a symbol that is still very medieval. Cures of the time included the use of leeches to remove the bad blood, and, as was mentioned in that early video that we watched at the beginning of this lecture, drilling holes into a patient's head to remove those bad spirits and cure them of their sickness. Well, you can imagine a hole drilled into your head, just open to the air. It was one of the main ways disease actually ended up getting in. But again, there's so many fun superstitions of the time that I enjoy. Look into them on your own time if you'd like. One in particular is the reason that we say bless you when one sneezes. At least in a Western tradition, we'll say bless you. Right? If someone coughs, right, the person who is, we in Western society expect the person who has coughed to say, excuse me. They need to be the one who apologizes. But if an individual sneezes, we are all tripping over ourselves to say bless you to that person. Why? Well, it's because of medieval superstition. In medieval thinking, when one sneezed, their soul literally was expelled from their body. Can you imagine? You sneeze, and your soul is just flushed out of your body. And so during medieval times, people would say, bless you, as in, may God bless you until your soul gets back. Because for a moment, you would be vulnerable, right? The bad spirits, the demons, they could all get in there and possess you in that little bit of time. So a quick prayer for God to bless this empty shell of a human being until their soul can get back to them. Right? That little prayer sticks with us to this day by saying bless you when someone sneezes. Anyway, that's all I want to dive into as far as the Middle Ages go. I'll talk a bit more in depth about some of the history when we look at the art and how the art relates to the history, but this will do for now. Again, as I said, we're in week 12, so we've got very little of this semester left to go. We do not have a quiz this week, but there will be one next week, so be ready for that. Anyway, thank you for going on this journey with me. Take care. Bye.